The Bible doesn't call us to a blind faith, a faith that ignores the truth around us. It calls us to an intelligent faith that we see as consistent with truth and consistent with reason. That's the simplest single-cell organism. You can't evolve until you have life. You have to have that to have life. Here's what he writes. Biologists must always keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Now think about what he's saying. I don't have the faith to be an atheist. That takes too much faith. I can't believe in that faith that goes against reason. We are going to be looking at Genesis 1 this morning, and we're going to be looking at the story of God's creation. In doing so, a lot of it's going to include some science, and it's going to be a little different than the normal message, because we're going to be looking at not only how God has revealed himself in the Bible, but we're going to also see even in the Bible that God says he's revealed himself through creation, through nature. And even because of science sometimes has visual element for us to be able to see, we're going to have some videos, some different things. But what we're going to be looking at is specifically focusing on God's creation of life. And really the day 3, in a sense, of the story of creation. So let me begin by looking at Genesis and what we read in Genesis 1 about creation. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 13. Let me start by reading those verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called the seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which their seed, each according to their kind, on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its own kind. And God saw it was good, and there was evening and morning, the third day. Let me begin with a word of prayer. Father, I thank you for the privilege that we have to come together this morning, Father, to be able to worship you, to be able to look at your word and to see how you revealed yourself. And Father, even now, to reflect upon how you reveal yourself in nature, in your creation. And Father, I pray that you would speak now and through me and in spite of me. Father, help us to hear, to see what you tell us. And Father, I pray for those that are here today that need the encouragement of their faith, that you would allow this to be an encouragement for those that are struggling, that are doubting, and Father, even for those that are seeking. That today would be a day that we honestly and openly look at the evidence, not only of your word, but of nature. Father, that the result would be a true and a strong and a real faith. We pray this blessing in Jesus' name. Amen. Now we're turning to Genesis 1, and what we're seeing is that's one account of how the world began, but it's one of two accounts about the creation of the world. See, many insist that we, not only we, but our world, everything around us, is the product of chance, of natural selection. First, life itself spontaneously appeared on this dead planet, and then through some incredible event that life began, that then you have the single cell that over time then evolved, and through undirected accidental chance mutations became the life that we see now around us today. Now that's a very different story than what the Bible teaches. According to the Bible, that we have Genesis 1:1 kind of sums it up. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then what we have is that the rest of Genesis kind of explains how he does it. And now what's often presented is in this debate between these two stories, it's often presented as, well, when you talk about creation, well, that's faith. You see, that's what the Bible teaches. And when you talk about evolution, well, that's science. But that's not at all the case. The first thing that we need to see is that both the position of creation and the position of evolution, both of them are beliefs that are both a science, appealing to science, but ultimately a position of faith. You see, the claims of evolution aren't all based on facts. They are based on faith and a presumption of something that cannot be proved by science. Materialists start with the presumption that there is no God, that in the beginning there was nothing and there can be no God. They start with the assumption the only thing that exists are what we can see in our material world. That is not a scientific claim. It cannot be proved by science. It's a claim that goes beyond science and then goes to the realm of faith. It holds that there was nothing and suddenly a little singularity came and it created everything. Well, see, that's a faith statement. And we have to look at that. There's no evidence for it at all. Now, on the other hand, when you look at the biblical story of creation in Genesis, it says that in the beginning that God created the heavens and the earth. Now, again, I'm going to acknowledge that this account also goes beyond science. It claims that before there was anything, there was a God, an all-powerful, all-eternal God who was the source of everything. He spoke it into existence. Now, I cannot prove God scientifically. I cannot go back in time and redo creation to prove that it happened that way. Like the materialists who deny God, God cannot be proven by science. It's a claim of faith that goes beyond science or reason. But as we look at this question of creation and evolution, we need to realize that the debate is not between people of science and people of faith. Both creationists and evolutionists require faith, and both appeal to science to back up their claims. And the question is, which one is more consistent with the science, with the facts? Both of us have faith, but which one of us has a more reasonable faith? So in this early part of the series of Genesis, what we're doing is we're looking at the evidence of science to see which one of these claims is more reasonable. And I think we've seen thus far, and I think we're going to continue to see this morning, that the story of creation is far more consistent with the evidence that we can see, with the laws of nature. Now, there may be some that were wondering, well, why are we even going here? Shouldn't we just stay in the Bible? Some people will say, the Bible says it, God says it, I believe it, that's all that I need. But when you look at the Bible, what we need to realize is that in the Bible, God calls us to have a faith that is rooted in fact. He actually calls us to look at facts apart from his revelation in the Bible. See, now part of this is realizing that there aren't two types of truth. Some people would say, well, that's a religious thing. There isn't like scientific truth and religious truth. There is one kind of truth that's always true, and if it's not true, it's always not true. So the question, is there a God? That's not a religious question. It's a truth question. Either there is a God or there isn't. And whatever you believe or I believe doesn't change that. Either the world began by God's work of creation or it began through a big bang. One is right, one is wrong. And because all truth is absolute truth, the Bible calls us to have a faith that is rooted in fact. So it calls us to look to history, or it calls us to look to science and test and be confident in the truthfulness of the biblical claims. So when it comes here to creation, to science, the Bible is actually very clear in calling us to look to the evidence of science. Why? Because the Bible teaches that God has revealed himself in part through his creation. He's also revealed himself in his word. And therefore, since God reveals himself in two different places, we should expect those revelations to match up. So for example, we see in Romans chapter 1, we're told, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. God makes it clear. God reveals. And there are numerous other passages in the Bible that call us to look to nature, to learn from what we can observe. For example, one, in Job chapter 12, look what it says. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you. The birds of the heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of everything that has breath, and the breath of all mankind. So it's calling us to look at this. See, it's understanding the whole nature of faith, of biblical faith. See, biblical faith isn't a leap into the dark. It isn't something that we're supposed to believe just because the Bible says it, closing our eyes or going against even logic and reason. The Bible doesn't call us to a blind faith, a faith that ignores the truth around us. It calls us to an intelligent faith that we see as consistent with truth and consistent with reason. It isn't a leap into the dark in a sense, it's a step toward the light. Let me show a picture of this that I think makes clear. Probably my favorite illustration, some of you have seen this before, it's my favorite illustration as far as from film clips. It's from the old Indiana Jones movie, The Last Crusade. And in this, it's an old movie, but it's a great picture. You have Indiana Jones trying to find the Holy Grail. And he's got 3 challenges, and the last is the leap of faith. And in this clip, you see 2 pictures of what that leap of faith is. One, the way it's often presented, and one which I think is a far more accurate portrayal of what true biblical faith is. Watch and see.
The path of God. Only in the leap from the lion's head will he prove his worth. It's impossible. Nobody can jump this.
Ah! Indy! And you must hurry! Come quickly!
It's a leap of faith. Around.
You must believe, boy. You must believe.
Most of that clip shows the wrong view of faith. This idea that I don't see anything there, but if I believe enough, I step out in spite of the evidence, and my faith will allow me cross. That's not biblical faith. It's not saying that everything that says it's not true, but I choose to believe. It's not stepping out over a cliff where all the evidence says there's nothing there. It's actually what he did at the very end. You see, at the very end, what did he do? He goes to the other side and he picks up a bunch of dirt and he throws it out there. And you still can't see the bridge, but you can see the outline of the bridge. The bridge is still invisible, but he can see the outline. Can I prove that God exists? No. Can I put him in a test tube? No. Can I go back and replay creation? No. No more than an evolutionist can prove anything that they claim. But what I can do is that I can throw the dirt out there. And here's where faith comes in. While consistent with the known evidence, faith also goes beyond what we can know. But it's consistent with the known evidence. So we've got to look at it and use our logic and use our reason and study the evidence of, in this case, science, and say, is it consistent with that? See, what we're called to do is, in a sense, to evaluate the reasonableness of our faith. Not only the reasonableness of our faith of those of us who believe in the Bible and who believe in creation, but also I want to honestly look at the faith of evolutionists and challenge them. Okay, what is the reasonableness of that faith? Going back to this clip from Indiana Jones, what I want to do is I want to take the dirt, I want to throw it out there, and here we have 2 things. And if it falls to the ground here, and if it shows the outline of a bridge here, I'm going to put my faith in where there's the outline of the bridge. I think it would be foolish to put your faith in something where it's all fallen to the ground. That's not biblical faith. See, through these first weeks of the series on Genesis, we're going step by step, and we're trying to look at this whole creation story. And we're saying, here's what the Bible says, and here's what the story of evolution says about that aspect of how the world came into being. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at really the first day of creation, the creation of the heavens and the earth, and we looked at the universe and this whole story. Today, I want to look at the third day of creation and God's creation of life. What is the origin of life? In a sense, when we looked at 2 weeks ago God's creation of the heavens and the earth, we saw the evolutionary story as there was nothing. Nothing existed, and then a little singularity formed, and out of that singularity, there was a huge explosion, and suddenly everything was formed from nothing. And not only that, there was great order to that nothing, and so we looked at the evidence, and we said, okay, does the evidence of science seem consistent with that? And at least in my conclusion, I think it doesn't. Now, this week, what we're going to do is we're looking at the middle of the story. And we're looking at where God created life. Now, the evolutionist story is that there was a harsh rock, a lifeless rock, and there were chemicals there, and somehow those chemicals came together and spontaneously came together to create life. The story of creation was that God spoke it into existence. In a sense, we could say 2 weeks ago, we looked at the telescope, and we looked at this whole thing, and we were saying, okay, in creation and the evolution and the origin of life, and we said, okay, we looked at the telescope, and we looked at the sky, and we looked at the bigness of what God created. This morning, I want to go actually now to the microscope, and we're going to look down to the very smallest cellular level, and we're going to see even there the grandeur and greatness and beauty of God's design. Now, even if you don't like science, I think you're going to enjoy today, because what we're going to see is the amazing designing hand of God. So let's evaluate the evidence. An evidence to try to come up with defining what's a reasonable faith. Now, to understand this, when Darwin first proposed his theory of evolution, he believed, as everyone else did pretty much at that time, that a single-cell organism was incredibly simple. In Darwin's day, the single cell was viewed as a simple globule of protoplasm containing of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. And that was generally the view of the cell until the mid-1950s when electron microscopes were developed. And that allowed scientists to look at the cell in far more detail. Now, when everyone believed the cell was incredibly simple, because it was easy to believe that it happened accidentally. Life could arise spontaneously. It could happen by accident. And so then you get the cell, and then you'd have the process of evolution that would allow it to evolve. But in the 1950s, when you had these electron microscopes developed, scientists were able to look at the cell in incredible detail, and what they found is that it was anything but simple. In fact, it's incredibly complicated. And what we're going to look at is I think, amazing. We're going to see this morning, the evidence of science agrees with God. It agrees with this idea of a wondrous creator. And we're going to see that the evidence argues against those who believe in materialism and evolution, even to the point where we're going to quote from some of their scientists who basically are forced to admit that they believe, but a blind faith that goes against the evidence. So let me start by going all the way back to Darwin. Okay, when we look at Charles Darwin, what is his standard for evaluating evolution? See, his whole theory was based on the idea that simple life could develop by accident. And then from that simple life, through the process of natural selection, one step at a time, it could slowly evolve. It can mutate in a sense, so that it would grow into more complex forms of life. But it had to start simple. In chapter 6 of his book, Origin of Species, Darwin said this about evolution and about evaluating it. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, here's what he's saying. You cannot start with the complex. And if science proves that there's complexity that could not have developed from simplicity, when he says my theory would break down, he's basically saying you have to reject it. It doesn't work. It's false. All right, so let's look at the most simple aspect of life. Let's look at the cell. A single cell. This is not a complicated single cell organism. The most simple thing where life began, according to evolutionists. The problem actually doesn't even start with the cell. It actually begins with the things that you need to have to make the cell. See, cells are generally made from proteins. Well, not generally, they are. They're made from proteins. It's the building blocks of life. I'm going to touch on this really briefly. If you want to go deeper, I'm glad to share more information. Through the electron microscopes, scientists determined that basically cells are all made up of different kinds of proteins. Now, here's the problem. Before there was a cell, there had to be proteins that came together to form the cell. But from what we experience and know in nature, where do proteins come from? From cells. The only place that proteins come from is they're formed by cells and in living beings. So where did they come from? How do you have proteins when they only come from living beings? Now, neo-Darwinism would say that, well, there were chemicals that existed and somehow they were in this primordial soup and something like lightning struck and somehow these all came together and they combined life. They talk about this as chemical evolution. It's part of evolution. But here's what you need to realize. There's no evidence to suggest this is possible. There's no evidence to suggest it's ever been possible. In fact, the opposite seems to be the evidence. Why? Because here's what evidence shows. If you take proteins and you take them out of a living cell and you expose them to natural elements, you know what happened? They break down. Never have there been a place where you've had amino acids joined together to be a protein. They break down. That's what the evidence shows. Now, not only that, but when you think about this, how would they come together? You would need not just one, you need many. Now, again, this is really complicated, and I'm not going to get too much into it, but you have amino acids, where did they come from? And then if you think about amino acids, there's 20 different amino acids. A protein chain, think about 26 letters in our alphabet, okay? So it's kind of like that. A protein chain, the simplest, is about 150 amino acids long. So again, if you have a bunch of Scrabble letters and you throw them out there, what's the chance of getting a long word? 150 letters, and they have to be just right in proper combination. If not, it doesn't work. And they say gibberish, and here you have proteins where it's not only 150, they actually fold over. They're incredibly complex, 3D. And that's the simplest. The more complex is like 1,000. And you need to have not one protein, you need to have hundreds of proteins to form a single cell. Now, how did that all happen by chance, by accident? Now, again, the problem is way deeper than that and far more complicated. But if you want more information, I'd be glad to share that on that. I want to spend more time going into the complexity of the single-cell organism. So again, this is the thing that life began in, supposedly. And again, Darwin started off as saying, well, it's just this simple protoplasm. But again, what we've discovered through the microscope now is it's incredibly complicated. This single cell consists of 10 million atoms. It's got all these different things. It's got all these. It's basically, they say it's like a factory doing all these complicated tasks. Now, I could try to explain it to you, and I don't think I'm going to do a very good job. So what I've done is I found a video, and I'm going to take a clip from a video. This is called The Mystery of Unlocking the Mystery of Life. And I will tell you, unless you're a really serious scientist, it's going to be hard to keep up with this, okay, because this is a lot of science. But here's what I want you to look at. When you watch this video, this description of the cell, does this look like it's simple, that could happen by accident? Because this is where life began. This had to happen by accident. It could not evolve. See what you think.
Science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the earth.
You remember any of that? That's overwhelming. But here's what I want to ask you. Does that look like an accident? If everything, and people say, well, that evolved. No, that's the simplest single-cell organism. You can't evolve until you have life. You have to have that to have life. Does that look like it happened by accident? It actually is even more complicated than that. Let me share another really short video from a group called Science Uprising. And they've got some wonderful stuff. If you want to get into this, scienceuprising.com, they've got a bunch of different videos that really go deep into this. And here's a short clip. And what he does is he talks about how the cell is not only that, but it's actually like a factory, but it goes beyond a factory. Could you imagine a Ford factory and someone argues that it all came by chance? It's all by accident? No, clearly that's a sign of a builder, of design. But what they're going to argue is that the human cell is incredibly more complicated than any factory that people have ever built.
With all of origin of life research going on, the problem is becoming harder all the time, not easier. And the reason it's become harder is because we understand more about the complexity of a cell.
To help explain the complexity of living cells, we turn to molecular biologist Douglas Axe.
To get an idea of the complexity of a living cell, think of a factory with thousands of pieces of machinery all working together to do some coordinated task. A cell is actually far more complicated than that factory because factories don't maintain themselves. People have to maintain factories, and factories certainly don't make new factories. Whereas with a living cell, all the parts that wear out are automatically remanufactured within the cell. Not only that, the cell is manufacturing a new cell as well. Human-made factories don't even come close.
Now you look at that, and again, it's overwhelming. And here's what you need to realize. We have two stories. One is there is a God who designed. The other is that it's all the result of chance and of nature. Now look, I want to just be open and honest and say if both of them are possible, let's throw the dirt out there. Which one seems more consistent with the evidence? Does that look like it's the product of design? Or does it look like it's a product of chance, that it could have happened by chance? Let me go back to Darwin and his own standard. When he said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successful modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And here you're saying the most simplest thing, the cell that you look at is so incredibly complicated by his own standard. He's saying, you have to reject my theory. It doesn't work. We're throwing the dirt of science out there, and by Darwin's standard, it's all falling to the ground. And you have evolutionary scientists, top evolutionary scientists basically agree with that. Let me give you a couple quotes. One was, these are people who believe in evolution in spite of the evidence. This is a Harvard chemist, George Whiteside. He said, most chemists believe, as I do, that life emerged spontaneously from a mixture of molecules in the prebiotic earth. How? I have no idea. We need a really good new idea. Now, do you hear what he's saying? This is a chemist. He's saying, I believe this. How? I have no idea. Because all the evidence shows that it's false. But at the end of the day, what is he saying? I still believe it. Because you start with the presumption that there is no God. And then he says, I have this faith and I'm going to believe blindly, even though all the dirt's fallen to the ground. And meanwhile, we have on this other side, all the evidence points towards design, towards a creator. See, that's what we need to realize is that's what science is telling us. And it actually gets worse for the evolutionists because as we learn about the cell, we not only learn about the molecules and all that, we're learning that a key part of the cell is DNA. And DNA, more than anything else, is information. See, scientists have generally looked at the question of matter and energy, and could random organic matter somehow organize itself into complex biological structures? But as difficult as those questions are, we're finding in DNA is information. DNA is an incredible amount of information. And so we're saying, how could that happen by itself? Again, let me go to another video, a short video from the Science Uprising, where they talk about this problem.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, DNA is more advanced than any software ever created. Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart. The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be. So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from? Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a program? Materialists think so, through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution. Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller, Darwin's Doubt, explains.
According to neo-Darwinism, new genetic information arises as a result of random mutations in the arrangement of the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule. If those random changes are beneficial, they're passed on and preserved, and if many such changes are preserved and passed on, they would accumulate over time and eventually result in a very significant change in the morphology, the form of the organism.
That's like saying if this game had glitches every time it was copied online, and gamers shared their favorite mutated versions and trashed the rest, it would eventually turn into this. Come on, really? If we know the computer glitches won't produce a new video game, how much sense does it make to believe that glitches, copying errors, and our DNA code can produce new organisms? Could random mutations in DNA really produce this? 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 What about this? 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 This, or this.
Everything we know about software shows that random changes in a section of functional code or functional information is going to degrade that information long before you ever get to something fundamentally new. And that's the problem with the mutation selection mechanism as an explanation for new genetic information. Information in DNA is also essentially typographic or digital. And there are far more ways to go wrong in arranging those characters than there are ways to go right. And so as you begin to randomly change them, you inevitably fall into a non-functional abyss long before you ever generate anything fundamentally new.
So and what you've got to realize is that DNA is information, and it's incredibly packed information. Again, we're talking if I go to the simplest single-cell organism, they estimate that the amount of information in DNA would be equivalent to thousands of pages of content. Now here you just want to think about that. Again, we know by experience, every time you have information, it only comes from a mind. Information does not come by accident. Think about it this way. If I were to say, okay, here's some Scrabble letters, to be or not to be, that is the question. Do you think this happened by accident? How much would I have to pour out Scrabble letters to get something like this? And again, the problem is far worse, because even if you could argue, if you do enough, eventually we'd do that. Again, DNA, the simplest form of DNA, is thousands of pages. And someone would say, well, but if you got 2 right, and then eventually you'd get the next line, and eventually, if you just had enough time, well, no, you can't save the 2 that you have. Everything is by chance. You have to get it all at once. I mean, that is beyond, again, impossible. And then people say, well, it's mutation. Well, again, no, this isn't mutation. This is how life began. You had to have this for the first single cell to begin. Again, do you see how impossible it is? And so how do people evaluate it? Let's take Francis Crick. Again, he was the guy who discovered DNA and kind of mapped it. And listen to what he writes. Now, here again, he believes in evolution. Here's what he writes. Biologists must always keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Now, think about what he's saying. What he's saying is we need to remember that even though all the evidence points towards design, we have to believe what the evidence is telling us isn't the case. He's saying we're taking all the dirt and we're throwing out here, and all the dirt is falling to the ground, and it's telling us this could not have happened. And meanwhile, there's a lot of evidence here that points towards design that's consistent with that, but we have to remember that we believe what evidence is against. That's what he's telling us. It falls to the ground, and yet he chooses to remind himself to believe that the evidence is wrong. Why? Because he starts with the assumption there is no God, and then he has a faith that chooses to reject God in spite of the evidence. And my friends, here's what I want to encourage you. If you're here as a follower of Christ, know that your faith, there is a reason behind your faith. There is evidence. And people may attack it and say, well, you don't know. People that attack it really don't know the science. Or they start with the assumption there is no God, and they really haven't looked at this. There may be some you have been attacked, and you're not sure what to believe. I hope that not only you've been encouraged today, I would love to engage you more. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. And I would love to engage you more to help you become sure in your faith. There may be some who you've walked in here today and you don't believe in God. You believe in evolution. You believe that creation couldn't have happened. Again, I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. I hope that you are willing to look and to be open and honest and to go where not just blind faith, but to go where the evidence of reasonable faith leads you. See, part of this, we've got to say, how do we understand the meaning and the complexity of life? Here's what I want you to think about just in closing. If God had created life, which I believe he did, could he have created it more simply? I mean, did he really need to have DNA with thousands of pages of information for the simplest cell life? Couldn't he have created a cell so that it was far more simple? Couldn't God have, in a sense, created life so that there were more simple conditions? Why did it have to be so complicated? Well, let's go back to Romans 1. What's we're told? For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So that he's saying, I knew that one day you're going to have scientists that are going to have theories and try to argue against it, and you're going to go to the evidence, and he's saying you're without excuse. This is clear. God has made it so complicated because it's evidence that proves the reasonableness of our faith. He says, I want you to have a faith where you take the dirt out and you throw it out there because it's going to tell you that, yes, while believing in God still goes beyond your reason, it is consistent with reason. And you're going to hear the lies of the culture that say, no, you're the product of evolution. It's by chance. And we'll take out the dirt and you throw it out there. And the evidence is going to prove that, no, that's impossible to believe. As we said a couple weeks ago in the book, I don't have the faith to be an atheist. That takes too much faith. I can't believe in that faith that goes against reason. But not only that, there's one other thing that we need to realize. See, God is telling us that not only we are the product of his creation, but he has made it so complicated to help us to be aware. Why? Because that's his pursuit of us. That's his pursuit of you. It's the evidence of God pursuing you. That it's God's way of saying, I want you to know. Why? Because I want a relationship with you. That not only that I'm just proving that I'm right, but I'm a creator God who wants to know you. And I'm pursuing you. I love how John gospel begins. And John begins telling us that Jesus Christ was the creator. And now he talks about he's the light, which gives light to everyone. He was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. Even as we rejected him, God was still pursuing us. He came into his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. That's why God reveals this, because he wants a relationship with you. He wants to know you intimately. He's not only the creator God who created and say, well, good luck and hope it all works. And no, he's a creator God that is still involved, that knows you, that knows the number of hairs on your head, that cares about you. And even as you rejected him, he's the creator God that loved you so much that he actually came into creation, taking on human form, ultimately taking on death to die on the cross so that you could have a relationship with him. Do you know him in that way? I hope and pray that you do. If not, understand everything that we're saying here today tells us not only that there is a God who has made you, there's a God who loves you and who invites you into relationship with him. How do we respond to him?
If you have a question about the message, Community Church, or Jesus Christ, send us a text to 330-400-3242. You can learn more about our events and community groups at ccpl.life/connect. There you can also send in a prayer request. We would love to pray for you. Have a blessed Lord's Day, and we'll see you on Sunday.